Okay, so now the hard work really starts. You thought the conference was over. Oops. The conference has just begun because everybody has to now think about what are those next steps. First of all, raise your hand if you're staying to help us create the work plan. So if you're not, look around your table, and if you have people with you who are staying, make sure you give them your pearls of wisdom before you exit the room. We would so wish that everybody could stay, but theoretically it was just not possible to have such a large group creating a work plan. So these are the disciples who were tapped for Saturday work, and we are very grateful to all of you who are going to stick around. For those of you who are leaving, just realize that we will be keeping in close touch with you through technology. The website will be full of ideas, information, and plans moving forward, and in return, we would certainly like to hear from everybody with ideas as they come forward. I just have a couple little ways of trying to pull together a few thoughts. Obviously, the IQ in this room is so enormous, and it was impossible to even come close to embracing all of the neat things that are on the wall and in your brains and articulated by your mouths, and it was all a really, really rich experience. But I'll just touch on a few things. And one is that we are seeking still to identify what is the audience and who is, what are those metrics of environmental literacy. You've probably all seen this picture from Environmental Defense, the average American family, and what they own and how they value things. And I think we all kind of know that we're working with this national audience, we're working with youth, and as we heard today from Sonia, we also believe that we're working with a global audience. So the task is really daunting about how we can move forward. Julie Reynolds is our artist. She created this overnight. I'm so amazed. We called it a food web at our table. I actually asked them to label it for me, but what she did was she wanted to articulate visually what an environmentally literate person is, and I'll just home in on the center of that food web for the minute. And you can see here she made a really neat kind of visual of how we might move forward looking at some of these important concepts in a visual sense. Don't worry about the details here. Obviously you can't even see this in the back because I was sitting back there before and I couldn't see it, but it does incorporate these things like civic engagement, like written communication and oral communication, and all of these things that we've been talking about. So the bottom line is, in there somewhere could be a way of trying to figure out the metrics and the definition of what environmental literacy is all about. So Julie's coming back next year, and she's going to have a whole hypothesis and thesis on it, and watch for her paper in Science Magazine, right, Julie? So we're so grateful. Thank you. Check that one off the list. And but it is a neat thought to be forever looking at these different ways that we might be able to articulate things. So we have this vision now of the fact that we have a very diverse audience, young, old, global, local, and we feel strongly, I think for the most part, that we need to all start somewhere, but tap those diverse audiences as best as possible. I think the group did a really great job of identifying who needs to be in on the conversation. We heard even a few more this morning that I tried to include, but it's not final yet. We'll be gleaning everything from these posters around the room later, but we had yesterday the Department of Defense in the military sector, the clergy, the representation of kids, transportation, horticulturalists, media trainers, and maintenance staff. Today we heard more about the gaming industry, about health practitioners, and there were a couple more that even came up after I stopped typing on my computer because I tended to get distracted about writing the notes versus listening, and I'm just really happy that we can write all those down later. But the neat thing is I think we really did a good job of covering who needs to be at the table. Obviously corporate groups were brought up later this morning, and a few others that will get on that list. Every other slide is a kid. I thought I would do that just to keep you awake because I hate these boring black and white slides. This one is the worst, but a lot of you had some good data yesterday on action plans. Some of the groups actually had 1-year plans, 2 to 5-year plans, and then 5 to 10-year plans, which was really neat. And then you even further organized your thoughts about what had the most leverage, what were the small moves, and who else comes into the conversation. So again, we have a really nice structure. An example here would be the most leverage this group felt was in year 1 to do things, to utilize informal resources to make learning applicable to the real world. Sorry about that typo. And then legislation in 2 to 5 years and 5 to 10 years to be building, to be changing the way communities are being restructured so they have a trajectory of how they see this sustainability education or environmental education coming into play. So amazing pearls of wisdom there that the group tomorrow will be forced with the hard task of trying to prioritize a lot of these different choices and see how is it we can make a laundry list, make a recipe, have some sort of coming together of resources on one website. The way that this information is transmitted back to all of you is also part of the discussion for tomorrow because none of us is the gospel as far as figuring out what is the best way to disseminate the information, but please know that that will be a big part of our conversation. Children, students, action items. We had some really great action items brought up, and hopefully everyone will go home and carry out one that might be your favorite. It might be the easiest in your community. Maybe it is the most doable, but it would be really neat for Teresa to send out a survey next year to say which action items did you execute. We had, of course, the gardening. We had the green buildings and architecture is an important idea for action. We had people thinking harder about creating specific languages for different audiences. We have now a whole new toolkit brought to us by our technology groups that might help us make learning more global. It might help us make learning more local because in many cases technology is proving useful for physically handicapped or other underrepresented groups. We have the informal science education groups that might take on learning after school or Sundays or as families or as centers and communities where we can have ways to engage in formal science education outside of the classroom. We have these very cool and new things like gaming jams that Russell brought to us. What are these creative new techniques? Twitter, where is that Twitter girl woman of mine, Amelia? But anyway, she's Twittering this conference back to North Carolina, and it's all pretty amazing, but these are the waves of the future for how we need to communicate. Empowering students was brought home by Lynn's videos this morning and also by several of the student comments, how important it is to give students some ownership in some of these decisions. And for all of us and all of our colleagues outside of this room, we need to think of those important ways to keep the conversation going. So somehow in the end, we have this Amazon.com, I call it, for lack of a better word, this ability to disseminate the best practices in the most efficient and effective way, saving time, money, and energy. So breakout groups, a lot of ideas brought forward, branding and marketing, teaching change agent skills, building networks, empathy and personal connection. I thought that was kind of a cool one. Now, who said that? Raise your hand. I loved looking at these lists last night, especially after cocktails, but I hope that's what you really said. Educating educators, service learning, and fun. That was another neat one that came up in a couple lists, which was wonderful. So just gives you a little flavor for how you all were thinking. And what are the small moves that would make the difference, that makes the difference? And again, we had the business to try to influence journalism. We had the issues with greening the schools and urban gardening and vocabulary. We had the idea of scientists mentoring, scientists communicating is really what that's all about. Can scientists do a little better in their daily practices to reach out to more audiences? We still have the parents out there, which I think is a really important underutilized and under-communicated group. And then we have this sort of collective thought about creating best practices to access groups to make the difference with the smallest amount of efforts. Some of the big questions that some of the different sheets were highlighting: what does an environmentally literate citizen look like? I can't wait for us to get hold of those orange and green sheets. My student, Angelique, there she is. Thank you, darling. She is meticulously typing all of these so we can have that pretty soon and know exactly what you all thought this person looked like, so that will be really neat. We had the big question: what are the best practices for sharing best practices? How can we inspire action after conversation? And of course, how can we make sure we're linked to these really important other issues: economy, health, food, the astronauts, as Brian called them, meaning the role models or the rock stars that are out there inspiring people. How do we think about the virtual and the real nature, and how do we make sure that it's always inclusive with diversity represented? How do we make it fun? That came up in the last slide, but it seems to be a recurring theme for the American audience these days, and probably global as well. And finally, everyone, I think at some point in your groups, talked about the importance of collaboration. So finally, thoughts that just kind of kept coming out in the computer. Be bold. I think that was Brian's 2 words today that really resonated, but everyone else has said it in many other ways. To accept change, take risks, outside the box, how do we think differently? So that's really a good take-home message. That best practices involve doing. We heard that from the students today, which was really, really neat, that we need to be involved in teaching and learning that involves activity and action and not just classroom and passive conversation. Civic engagement, that was a wonderful term that came up, and especially this morning. What about using it as a metric of environmental literacy? That seemed a very, very thoughtful suggestion. And of course, integrating sustainability education from K through 12. We heard about how can the 5th grade teacher do everything in one class? How can we make sure that all of the learning for students is integrated through this track of public school systems? Any vision of the environment should include people. We had that wonderful 10 seconds with our eyes closed. I think we all probably need about 10 hours right now. But that was a really neat exercise. I think that it was sobering for those of us that might not have had people in our vision of how the environment looks. And then, of course, again and again, those issues of health, economics, food, the basics in life that have to be linked to environmental issues, which we all know they are, but maybe the rest of the world doesn't. Finally, some organization to our advocacy was suggested, and perhaps most important, sharing our solutions. I think it's a really exciting thought to take the website next year and make sure that we all report solutions. And as Samir mentioned, maybe we put them in the journal solutions, which is another really neat thought, to be sure that best practices are being shared with the most widely disseminated group that we can possibly come up with. So, in closing, I'll just show you my little friend here, and he was in 7th grade when I did the Jason project in Belize. This was actually a pre-Jason project video out in the forests of Washington State, and this kid had never, of course, picked up one of those crazy little what is it? Oh my gosh, I'm having a senior moment, but those slimy things that live in your forest out. Yes, thank you, a slug. And he was so proud of that. And I gave a talk at University of Florida 2 years ago. They had a scholarship program, and this tall, handsome kid came up and said, "You remember me? I was in your distance learning program, and now I'm a biology major." So, you know, we don't maybe touch millions of people, but if we touch 1 or 2 through these combinations of technology and real nature, maybe that's the best thing we can do. So, thank you.